Arizona Territory, 1873. When Samuel Brennan rode into Prescott with a dying woman in his wagon, the whole town said he'd be burying her within the month. They called him a fool for marrying a consumptive, said love was no cure for rotting lungs. 50 years later, she'd outlive half the men who warned him, and the story of how became legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high desert of Arizona Territory had a way of testing what a man was made of. Samuel Brennan had come to understand this truth the way most men learned their own names. Through repetition, through pain, through the slow accumulation of years that turned certainty into dust. He'd arrived in Prescott in the spring of 1869, 24 years old, with a timber claim, a wagon, and the kind of stubborn optimism that the desert hadn't yet beaten out of him. 4 years later, the optimism was gone. The timber claim remained. His operation sat in the ponderosa pine forests north of town, where the elevation rose enough to escape the worst of the summer heat. The trees grew tall and straight there, perfect for mining timbers and railroad ties. He'd built a sawmill beside Granite Creek, where the water ran year-round and strong enough to turn the blade. The mill house was simple: 4 walls, a roof, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean. A single window faced east to catch the morning light. Samuel worked alone. He'd hired men before, drifters mostly, who'd stay a season and move on. Some couldn't handle the isolation. Others found the work too hard for the pay. A few simply disappeared one night, tired of the endless whine of the saw blade and the smell of fresh-cut pine. Eventually, he stopped hiring. The mill ran well enough with just him, and solitude had its advantages. No one to answer to, no one to disappoint. He rose before dawn each day, when the air still held the coolness of night. The first task was always the fire, building it in the mill's boiler, feeding it split pine until the pressure gauge climbed into the working range. While the steam built, he'd walk the perimeter of his property, checking the stacks of lumber curing in the sun, looking for signs of rot or insect damage. The desert might be dry, but it had its own ways of destroying what a man built. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the saw blade was screaming, and Samuel was feeding logs through it with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done the same thing 1,000 times before. The work was dangerous. One moment of inattention could cost him a hand, an arm, worse. But danger kept a man focused, and focus kept the loneliness at bay. Prescott itself lay 5 miles south, a growing town that had survived Apache raids, drought, and the usual violence that followed gold strikes and cattle drives. It had a main street lined with false front buildings, a territorial courthouse built of granite, and enough saloons to keep the miners and ranchers suitably drunk. Samuel rode into town once a week for supplies: flour, coffee, lamp oil, whatever else he needed. He'd load his wagon at Morrison's general store, exchange a few words with the proprietor, and ride back to the mill without lingering. People knew him, but they didn't know him well. He was polite, but not friendly, reliable, but not sociable. The kind of man who attended church on Christmas and Easter, but sat in the back row and left before anyone could corner him for conversation. Women had shown interest over the years: a widow who ran a boarding house, a shopkeeper's daughter with dark eyes and a quick smile. But Samuel had never pursued anything beyond courtesy. He told himself it was the work, the mill, the practical reality that his life wasn't suited for company. The truth, if he'd been honest enough to admit it, was simpler. He'd loved once, badly, and had no interest in repeating the experience. Her name was Caroline. They'd met in Missouri before the war, when Samuel was 17 and thought he understood how the world worked. She'd been beautiful in the way that young women are beautiful when you're 17. Everything bright and possible, and just out of reach. They'd talked of marriage, of a farm somewhere, of children. Then the war came. Samuel rode south with the Missouri volunteers. Caroline promised to wait. She hadn't. The letter arrived in a military camp outside Vicksburg, forwarded through 3 different regiments before it found him. It was brief, apologetic, final. She'd married a banker's son, someone who'd stayed home, someone who could give her the life she wanted. Samuel had read the letter once, burned it, and never spoke of it again. When the war ended, he'd drifted west. The timber claim was something he'd won in a card game from a man who'd lost interest in hard work. Samuel had filed the papers, built the mill, and settled into a life that asked nothing of him except sweat and solitude. It was enough. It had to be. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late September, everything changed. He'd been in town longer than usual that day. A broken saw blade needed replacing, and the only one in stock required modification to fit his mill's arbor. He'd spent the better part of the morning at the blacksmith shop, watching the smith heat and hammer the steel into the proper configuration. By the time the work was finished, it was past noon, and the heat of the day had settled over Prescott like a wool blanket. Samuel was loading the blade into his wagon when he heard the commotion, voices rising in pitch and urgency coming from the far end of the street. He looked up to see a small crowd gathering near the stage depot. Curious despite himself, he walked over. The Butterfield stage had just arrived, dust still hanging in the air around the horses. The driver was down from his seat, talking fast to anyone who'd listen. Samuel caught fragments. Near collapsed before we hit Skull Valley. Burning up with fever. Thought she'd die before we made town. The crowd parted slightly, and Samuel saw her. She was sitting on the depot's bench, slumped against the wall, her face pale as lamplight. A woman, maybe 30 years old, though illness made age hard to judge. She wore a dress of faded blue calico, travel-stained and dusty. Her hair, dark brown and coming loose from its pins, hung limp around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that caught him, grey-green, enormous in her thin face, and filled with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to radiate from her like heat. Doc Hartley was there, the town's only physician, a man in his 60s with white whiskers and a perpetual expression of grim assessment. He had his hand on the woman's wrist, counting her pulse. After a moment, he released her arm and stepped back, shaking his head. "Consumption," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Advanced stage, fever, night sweats, blood in the lungs. She needs bed rest, good food, and prayer, though I doubt prayer'll do much good at this point." Someone in the crowd muttered agreement. Another voice, female, said something about the sanitarium in Tucson. The woman on the bench said nothing. She simply stared at the ground, her hands folded in her lap, as if the conversation didn't concern her. Samuel found himself stepping forward without quite deciding to do so. "She got people here?" he asked. Doc Hartley glanced at him, surprised. "You know her?" "No, just asking." The doctor shook his head. "Came in on the stage alone. No luggage except that." He gestured to a small carpet bag sitting beside the bench. "I asked if she had family in town. She said no." "Then where was she headed?" "She didn't say, or couldn't. She's barely strong enough to talk." The crowd was already losing interest, drifting away now that the immediate drama had passed. Death from consumption was common enough. No spectacle in watching someone slowly suffocate. The stage driver climbed back onto his seat, ready to move on. Doc Hartley stood there a moment longer, then sighed. "I'll see if the boarding house has a room," he said to no one in particular, "though Mrs. Fletcher won't be happy about taking in someone contagious." Samuel looked at the woman again. She still hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. Something in her stillness, not resignation exactly, but a kind of quiet endurance, struck him with unexpected force. "I'll take her," he heard himself say. Doc Hartley turned. "What? I've got room. The mill house. She can stay there." The doctor stared at him, as if he'd announced plans to sprout wings. "Samuel, the woman's dying. Consumption's not something you recover from, especially not this far along. She'll need constant care, and even then, I understand. Do you? Because taking her in means exposing yourself to the disease. It means watching her waste away. It means burying her, most likely within the month." I said I understand. Doc Hartley studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Your funeral, or hers more likely." He turned to the woman. "Miss, this man's offering you a place to stay. You understand what I told you about your condition?" The woman finally looked up. Her gaze moved from the doctor to Samuel, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no hope in her expression, no gratitude, no expectation of kindness, just a flat acceptance of whatever came next. "Yes," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough as sandpaper. "I understand. What's your name?" Samuel asked. Josephine Caldwell." "Samuel Brennan. Can you walk to the wagon?" She nodded, though when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Samuel caught her before she fell, one arm around her shoulders, the other supporting her weight. She weighed almost nothing, bird bones and fever heat. He could feel her trembling with the effort of staying upright. He got her to the wagon and lifted her into the back, where he'd laid out a canvas tarp over the lumber. She curled onto her side immediately, eyes closing. Samuel retrieved her carpet bag, set it beside her, then climbed onto the driver's seat. Doc Hartley was still standing there, shaking his head. "You're a damn fool, Samuel Brennan. Probably. When she dies, don't come crying to me about it." Samuel picked up the reins. "When she dies, I'll bury her myself." He drove out of town without looking back. The ride to the mill took just over an hour. The road climbed steadily through juniper and pinyon, then into the ponderosa forest, where the air cooled and the shadows deepened. Samuel drove slowly, trying to spare Josephine the worst of the ruts, though he could hear her coughing in the wagon bed, deep, rattling coughs that sounded like something breaking inside her chest. When they reached the mill, he stopped the wagon near the house and went around to check on her. She was awake, staring up at the sky through the pine branches. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and quick. "We're here," he said. She nodded but didn't try to sit up. Samuel reached in and lifted her out, carrying her to the house. Inside, he laid her on his own bed, the only bed, and covered her with a quilt his mother had made years ago, one of the few things he'd carried west. Josephine's eyes were closed again. Her breathing had a wet, labored quality that reminded Samuel of the sound a saw blade made when it hit a pocket of sap. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next, then went to build up the fire. By the time he had water boiling and a pot of weak broth simmering, darkness had fallen. He lit a lamp and set it on the table, then checked on Josephine again. She was asleep or unconscious, he couldn't tell which. Her face was slick with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead. Samuel pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices. The mill was silent, the saw blade still. For the first time in 4 years, Samuel Brennan's carefully ordered solitude had been broken. He didn't know why he'd done it, didn't know what he'd expected, didn't even know if the woman would survive the night. But she was here now, and whatever came next, he'd see it through. That was the kind of man he was. Josephine Caldwell woke to unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the kind that holds weight and texture. Somewhere close by, wood settled in a stove. Water dripped from eaves onto packed earth. Wind pushed through branches overhead, making them creak like old furniture. She kept her eyes closed, trying to place herself, trying to remember the sequence of events that had brought her here. The stage from Tucson, the fever climbing through her body like smoke, a town she didn't know the name of, voices discussing her, as if she were already a corpse. Then a man's face, weathered and careful, asking her name. She opened her eyes. The room was small but clean, log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace with embers glowing orange, a single window showing dawn light filtering through pine needles. She was lying in a real bed, not a boarding house cot or a stage seat or the ground. The quilt covering her smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Her carpet bag sat on a chair nearby. Someone had placed it there deliberately, within reach. The door opened. The man from town entered carrying an armload of split wood. He saw her watching and stopped. "You're awake," he said. Josephine tried to sit up. Her arms shook with the effort, and a cough seized her chest, deep and violent, rattling loose something wet that she turned her head to spit into her hand. Blood flecked her palm. She wiped it on the underside of the quilt, hoping he hadn't seen. He'd seen. Samuel crossed to the stove, loaded the wood, then poured water from a kettle into a tin cup. He brought it to her without comment, holding it steady while she drank. The water was warm, flavored with something bitter, willow bark maybe, or pine needle tea. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "How long?" she asked when she could speak. "2 days. You slept through most of it. Fever broke last night." 2 days. She had no memory of them, just fragments. Hands lifting her head, cool cloths on her forehead, a voice reading something aloud in the darkness. Whether those were real or fever dreams, she couldn't say. "Why?" she asked. Samuel set the cup on the small table beside the bed. "Why what? Why bring me here? The doctor said I was dying." "He did. Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not pity exactly, not kindness either, though there was something of that in it. More like recognition, the way someone might look at their own reflection and see something they'd forgotten was there. "Seemed like you needed somewhere to be," he said finally. "I had somewhere." It wasn't an answer, not really, but Josephine was too tired to press. She let her head sink back onto the pillow, feeling the exhaustion pull at her like a current. Before she slipped under again, she managed 3 words. "Thank you, Samuel." He nodded once, then left her to rest. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. Samuel would rise before dawn and work the mill until mid-morning, then return to check on Josephine. He'd bring her broth made from venison bones, or cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, or bitter tea that eased the coughing. She ate what she could, which wasn't much. Her stomach had shrunk from months of illness, and food sat in her like stones. But she didn't die. The doctor had given her a month at most. Yet days passed, then a week, and Josephine remained stubbornly alive. Weak, yes, fevered at night, shaking with chills that no amount of blankets could warm, but alive. Samuel didn't hover. He'd bring what she needed, make sure she was comfortable, then leave her alone. She appreciated that. Most people, faced with someone dying, felt compelled to fill the silence with platitudes or prayers, or their own discomfort. Samuel simply did what needed doing and went back to his work. On the 8th day, Josephine managed to stand. She made it from the bed to the chair, perhaps 6 feet before her legs gave out, and she had to grab the table to keep from falling. Samuel, who'd just come in with more wood, set down his load and steadied her without a word. "I need air," she said. He helped her to the door. Outside, the world was brilliant with autumn color. Aspens blazed gold against the dark green of pines. The creek ran silver over smooth stones. The air smelled of resin and earth and the complicated perfume of decomposing leaves. Josephine stood on the threshold, breathing it in, feeling sunlight on her face for the first time in what felt like years. "It's beautiful," she said. Samuel, standing beside her, looked out at his domain, as if seeing it fresh. "I suppose it is. How long have you been here?" 4 years. Built the mill the first summer. Alone? Mostly, she glanced at him. His profile was strong, straight nose, square jaw shadowed with several days' beard. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were scarred and calloused from work. Everything about him spoke of capability and self-sufficiency, yet there was a loneliness to him too. She recognized it because she carried the same. "Why alone?" she asked. "Easier that way." "Easier than what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "You should sit, don't want you falling." He brought out the chair, and she lowered herself into it, grateful. They sat in companionable silence, watching a jay work through the branches overhead, scolding something neither of them could see. After a while, Josephine said, "I should tell you about myself, since you took me in without knowing anything." "Don't have to." "I want to." Samuel leaned against the doorframe, waiting. "I was married," Josephine began, "in Ohio. My husband was a railroad clerk. Good man, steady work. We had a daughter." She paused, the words catching in her throat like fishbones. "Sarah. She was 3 when the scarlet fever came through. Took her in 4 days." Samuel said nothing, but his expression shifted, something in his eyes that might have been pain or memory. "My husband blamed me," Josephine continued. "Said I should have kept her away from other children. Should have seen the signs sooner. Maybe he was right. I don't know. He started drinking. I started coughing. The doctor said it was grief affecting my lungs, that it would pass. It didn't." She stopped to catch her breath, feeling the familiar tightness building in her chest. Samuel waited, patient as stone. "My husband left 2 years ago. Just disappeared one day. I got work as a seamstress, but the coughing got worse. Lost that job, lost the next one. Eventually, I lost the room I was renting. A church group bought me a ticket west. Said the dry air might help, so I came." "Has it helped?" Josephine considered this. "I'm still breathing. That's something." "Is it?" The question hung between them. Samuel pushed off the doorframe and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the mill. The saw blade caught sunlight, throwing a bright slash across the sawdust-covered ground. "My mother died of consumption," he said quietly, "when I was 12. Took her 2 years from first cough to last breath. I watched her waste away, watched my father try everything, doctors, patent medicines, prayer. Nothing worked, nothing ever works." Josephine felt something shift in her understanding of this man. Then, "Why take me in?" He turned to look at her. "Because no one should die alone, and because—" He stopped, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Because maybe stubbornness counts for something. You didn't look like someone ready to quit." "I'm not sure what I look like anymore." "You look like someone still here." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember. Josephine felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying took energy she didn't have. That night, for the first time since her arrival, she stayed awake after dark. Samuel had given her the bed and made himself a pallet near the stove, insisting it was warmer there anyway. She listened to him breathe in the darkness, steady and even, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. The second week brought changes. Josephine's appetite improved slightly. She could keep down eggs now, and bread soaked in milk, and once even a few bites of fried trout Samuel had caught in the creek. The coughing continued, still brought up blood, but the episodes were shorter. She could walk from the house to the mill and back without collapsing. Samuel seemed surprised by this, though he tried not to show it. He'd clearly expected her to deteriorate, not stabilize. Once, she caught him watching her cross the yard with an expression of puzzlement, as if she were a mathematical problem that refused to solve correctly. "I'm contrary by nature," she told him. "My mother used to say I'd argue with the sunrise. Seems to be working for you." So far, she began making herself useful in small ways, mending his shirts, which had holes worn through the elbows, sweeping the perpetual sawdust from the floor, organizing his meager kitchen supplies into something resembling order. Samuel accepted these contributions without comment, though she noticed he stopped leaving his coffee cup wherever he finished it and started hanging his coat on the peg by the door. They developed a routine. Mornings, Samuel worked the mill while Josephine rested and regained her strength. Midday, they'd eat together, simple food, simply prepared. Afternoons, if she felt strong enough, she'd sit outside and watch him work, sometimes reading aloud from the single book he owned, a battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Evenings, they'd share whatever game, birds, or fish Samuel had trapped or caught, then sit by the fire until sleep claimed them. Conversation came easier as the days passed. Samuel was not naturally talkative, but he'd answer questions if asked directly, and sometimes he'd volunteer information about the country, the timber business, the seasonal rhythms of life at elevation. Josephine learned he'd been a soldier. He didn't speak of the war directly, but references emerged. A mention of Missouri volunteers, a comment about how saw blades sounded like artillery at a distance, the way he'd flinch sometimes at sudden noises. She didn't press. Everyone who'd lived through those years carried scars, visible or otherwise. One afternoon, she was reading aloud when a coughing fit seized her. This one was worse than usual, bringing up enough blood that it stained her handkerchief bright red. Samuel, who'd been working nearby, came over immediately. "Inside," he said, helping her up. "I'm fine. You're bleeding." Inside. He got her to the bed and made her lie down, then brought water and the bitter tea. His hands were gentle but firm, the way someone handles something fragile but necessary. When the coughing finally subsided, Josephine lay back exhausted, tasting copper. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For being a burden, for not dying on schedule." Samuel's expression hardened. "Don't talk like that. It's true though, isn't it? You took me in expecting I'd be gone by now. Instead, I'm still here, taking your bed, eating your food, interrupting your work." "Stop." The sharpness in his voice surprised her. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stood with his back to her. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but strained. "You're not a burden. You're a person who's sick and needs help and doesn't deserve to apologize for existing." He turned to face her. "I don't know why you're still alive when you shouldn't be. Maybe it's the air here. Maybe it's spite. Maybe it's nothing more than a chance. But you are alive, and as long as you are, you're welcome here. Understand?" Josephine stared at him, seeing something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not just kindness or duty, but something raw, anger maybe, at the unfairness of it all, or defiance against the inevitability everyone else had accepted. "I understand," she said softly. He nodded once, sharply, then left the house. She heard the saw blades start up moments later, screaming through timber with renewed violence. That evening, they ate in silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who'd said what needed saying and didn't need to say more. Before bed, as Samuel was banking the fire, Josephine spoke from beneath the quilt. "Samuel? Yeah, thank you for getting angry." He glanced at her, confused. "What? Most people treat dying folks like we're already ghosts, like we're too fragile for real feeling. You yelled at me like I was a regular person being stupid." The corner of his mouth twitched. "You were being stupid. I know. It felt good to be called on it. Well, don't make a habit of it. No promises." She thought she heard him chuckle as he settled onto his pallet. Outside, the wind picked up, bringing the smell of coming snow. Inside, the fire crackled and settled. Josephine closed her eyes, listening to Samuel's breathing even out into sleep. For the first time since her daughter died, She found herself thinking about tomorrow, not with hope exactly, but with curiosity. What if she didn't die this month? What if she lasted through winter? What would that look like? She didn't have answers, but lying there in the darkness, wrapped in a cedar-scented quilt in a stranger's house high in the Arizona pines, Josephine Caldwell discovered something she'd thought lost forever. She wanted to find out. October turned to November, and the weather held. The days stayed clear and bright, the nights cold but not bitter. Josephine continued her slow, improbable recovery. She could now walk the full circuit of Samuel's property without stopping to rest. From the house to the mill, down to the creek, back up through the lumber stacks. Her appetite had returned enough that she'd started cooking their meals, simple fare, but better than Samuel's bachelor efforts. The coughing persisted, would probably always persist, but the blood came less frequently. Samuel had stopped mentioning her condition entirely. He treated her as he might treat any partner in a venture, with practical consideration and growing ease. They worked side by side now, Josephine sorting lumber by grade while Samuel ran the saw, or she'd tend the vegetable garden he'd neglected while he hauled logs from the cutting area. The town noticed, of course. On his weekly supply runs, Samuel fielded questions. Doc Hartley asked after her with barely concealed disbelief. Morrison at the general store made awkward inquiries about the sick woman. A few church ladies suggested with pointed delicacy that perhaps arrangements should be made for when the time came. Samuel told them all the same thing. She was managing. He didn't mention that she'd gained weight, that color had returned to her face, that she'd laughed 3 days ago at something a squirrel had done. Those details felt private, almost sacred. The town had written her death already. He saw no need to revise their narrative. But the mountain had its own ideas about endings. The storm arrived on a Wednesday. Samuel woke before dawn to an absence of sound so complete it raised the hair on his neck. He rose from his pallet and went to the window. Outside, the world had disappeared. Fog pressed against the glass, thick as cotton, reducing visibility to nothing. The air felt heavy, pregnant with moisture and the particular electricity that preceded violence. "Snow coming," he said aloud. Josephine, awake now, sat up in bed. "How can you tell?" "Air pressure, the way the trees sound, mostly just knowing." He dressed quickly, pulling on his heaviest coat. "Need to secure everything before it hits. Could you start bringing in firewood? As much as we can stack inside." She nodded and rose without complaint. They worked through the early morning in silent coordination. Samuel checked every window shutter, reinforced the mill roof with extra timbers, moved the horses into the small barn, and loaded it with hay. Josephine made trip after trip from the wood pile to the house, stacking split logs along every available wall until the interior resembled a fort. By noon, the fog had lifted enough to reveal clouds, vast, dark, rolling down from the north like an invading army. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The wind picked up, bending the pines and sending dead needles skittering across the ground. Samuel filled every container they had with water from the creek. Josephine cooked a large pot of beans and another of cornmeal, food that would keep if the fire went out. They worked until the light failed, and when Samuel finally came inside and barred the door, the first snowflakes were already falling. "We ready?" Josephine asked. Samuel surveyed their preparations. "As ready as we'll be." That night they ate by lamplight and listened to the wind build from whisper to howl. Snow hissed against the windows. The cabin timbers groaned and shifted. Neither of them slept much. Samuel added wood to the fire every few hours, keeping the heat steady. Josephine sat wrapped in the quilt, watching the flames, occasionally coughing but otherwise silent. By morning, the world had transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep against the door. Drifts climbed the north wall of the cabin, nearly reaching the roof. The mill had vanished, beneath white, only the peak of its roof visible. The trees bent under their burden, and 2 had fallen in the night. Samuel could see their broken tops jutting up like bones. "Never seen it come this heavy this early," he said, staring out through the gap he'd forced in the door. "Can we get out?" Josephine asked. "Not yet. Need to wait for it to stop." But it didn't stop. The storm continued through the 2nd day, then the 3rd. Snow piled higher. The temperature plunged. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire. Samuel rationed the firewood now, burning only enough to keep them from freezing. The food held out, but their water supply dwindled as the containers emptied, and going outside became impossible. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Samuel forced the door open against a drift and stepped out into a landscape he barely recognized. Snow had reshaped everything. The path to the mill was gone. The creek was buried. Even the clearing around the cabin had filled in, leaving only the tallest objects visible: the chimney, the barn roof, the tops of the fence posts. "Stay inside," he told Josephine. "I need to check the damage." He waded through snow that came to his waist, sometimes his chest. The mill was intact, but the roof had buckled in one corner under the weight. 3 more trees had fallen, one of them across his main lumber stack. The barn door had blown off its hinges. The horses were alive but frightened, covered in frost where their breath had frozen. It took him 2 hours to reach the creek and back, a journey that normally took 10 minutes. When he returned to the cabin, Josephine had coffee ready and a question in her eyes. "Bad?" she asked. "Could be worse. Mill's damaged but fixable. Lost some lumber. Need to clear those fallen trees before they bring down more." "How long will repairs take?" Samuel calculated in his head. "Week, maybe 2, if the weather holds." "And if it doesn't?" He didn't answer. They both knew the reality. Winter had arrived early and hard. If another storm came before he could repair the mill and replenish their supplies, they'd be in genuine danger. That afternoon, Samuel started the work. He cleared a path to the mill first, shoveling and stamping down the snow until he had a navigable trail. Then he assessed the roof damage. The buckling had cracked 2 support beams and torn loose a section of tin. Repairing it would require climbing up in sub-zero temperatures and working with frozen metal. He was halfway up the ladder when he heard Josephine scream. Samuel dropped everything and ran. He burst through the cabin door to find her collapsed beside the stove, blood pooling beneath her, not from her mouth, from her leg. She'd been adding wood to the fire when one of the logs had rolled, its weight catching her shin and driving a splinter the size of his finger deep into the flesh. "Don't move," he said, kneeling beside her. Her face was white, eyes wide with shock. "I'm sorry, I was just... Doesn't matter. Stay still." He examined the wound. The splinter had penetrated to the bone, and pulling it out would cause massive bleeding, but leaving it in risked infection, which in her weakened state could kill her as surely as the consumption. His hands, so steady with timber and tools, trembled slightly as he reached for his knife. "This is going to hurt," he said. Josephine nodded, biting down on a leather strap he gave her. Samuel worked quickly, cutting around the splinter to widen the wound, then extracting the wood in one smooth pull. Blood welled up immediately. He packed it with clean cloth, torn from a spare shirt, then wrapped the leg tight with strips of cotton. Throughout the process, Josephine made no sound beyond sharp intakes of breath. When he finally sat back, she released the strap and breathed out slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Can you stand?" She tried. Her leg buckled immediately, and she fell against him. Samuel caught her, feeling how light she still was, how fragile despite her improvements. He lifted her, easy as lifting kindling, and carried her to the bed. "Stay off it for 3 days minimum," he said. "Longer if I tell you to." "But the fire, the cooking?" "I'll manage. Samuel, you have the mill to repair, the wood to clear, And you have a hole in your leg that'll fester if you don't rest it. We both do what needs doing." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else underneath. Something that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "All right," she said quietly. For the next 3 days, their roles reversed. Samuel tended the fire, cooked the meals, changed her bandages. The wound was clean, no signs of infection, but it pained her considerably. She couldn't put weight on it without her vision graying at the edges. Meanwhile, the mill repairs stalled. Samuel could only work an hour or 2 at a time before having to return and check on Josephine. The temperature stayed below freezing. His hands cracked and bled from the cold. At night, exhausted, he'd collapse on his pallet and lie there feeling the accumulated strain of too many tasks and not enough hours. On the 4th morning, he woke to find Josephine standing. "What are you doing?" he demanded, rising quickly. "Testing it, the leg. I said 3 days minimum. It's been 3 days exactly, so I'm following instructions." She took a careful step, winced, but stayed upright. "It holds." Barely's enough." She hobbled to the stove and began building up the fire. "You've got work to do, Samuel. Real work. I can manage here. If that wound opens, then I'll wrap it tighter and keep going, same as you would." He wanted to argue, but she was right. The mill wouldn't repair itself. The fallen trees wouldn't clear themselves. Winter wouldn't wait for anyone's convenience. He pulled on his coat and gloves, checked her bandage, one more time despite her protests, then headed out. The work was brutal. Temperatures stayed near zero. The wind came in gusts that could knock a man down. Samuel's damaged hands made every task harder, gripping the hammer, climbing the ladder, wielding the saw. Twice he nearly fell from the roof. Once, a cut tree rolled wrong and almost crushed his foot, but slowly, incrementally, progress showed. The roof was patched, the fallen trees were sectioned and stacked, the barn door was rehung. Each night he'd return to the cabin to find Josephine had kept the fire going, prepared food, maintained their small fortress against the cold. They didn't talk much during those days. Both were too tired, too focused on survival, but there was a quality to their silence now that hadn't existed before. Not just acceptance, but partnership. They were fighting the same battle from different positions, and both knew the other wouldn't quit. On the 7th day, Samuel finished the major repairs. The mill was functional again, the immediate dangers addressed. He stood back, surveying his work, and felt something uncoil in his chest. They'd made it. Against the storm, the cold, the injuries and setbacks, they'd made it. He returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and gold. Inside, Josephine had managed to bake bread, real bread, not just cornmeal, and the smell of it filled the small space like a benediction. "Roof's done," he said, stripping off his frozen gloves. "I saw you working. It looks solid. Should hold till spring." He sat heavily in the chair, feeling every bruise and strain. "How's the leg?" "Better every day." She brought him coffee and a thick slice of bread with butter. "Eat." He obeyed, suddenly ravenous. They ate together in comfortable silence, the firelight warm on their faces. Outside, the first stars emerged in a sky gone deep blue. The crisis had passed. They'd survived. After supper, as Josephine was cleaning the dishes, she suddenly stopped and turned to face him. "Samuel, I need to say something." He looked up, surprised by the seriousness in her tone. "When I came here, I thought I was coming to die," she said. "I thought it would be quick, and I'd be buried by someone who at least knew my name, and that would be enough. But you didn't let me die. You fought for me, fought the storm, fought to keep this place standing, fought to keep me breathing, even when it made no sense. Josephine, let me finish. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. I don't know why I'm still alive. Maybe it's the air here, like you said. Maybe it's pure stubbornness. But I know this. I'm alive because you decided I should be. Because you didn't give up, even when everyone else already had. Samuel felt something hot and uncomfortable rising in his throat. You did the same for me. Kept the fire going. Kept us fed. Worked on an injured leg when you should have been resting. We both fought. Yes, she said softly. We did. Together, the word hung between them. Together. Not I and you, but we, somewhere in the past month. Without either of them naming it, they'd stopped being a dying woman and the man who took her in. They'd become something else. Partners. Allies, friends. Samuel stood, suddenly needing to move. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered world, at the mill he'd built and the life he'd carved from timber and solitude. It had been enough once. Now, standing there aware of Josephine behind him, he wasn't sure it would ever be enough again. I'm glad you stayed, he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. So am I. When he turned back, she was watching him with an expression that made his heart stumble. Not gratitude, not obligation, something warmer and more dangerous. Get some rest, he said, his voice gruff. We both need it. She nodded and retired to the bed. Samuel banked the fire and settled onto his pallet, but sleep was long in coming. He lay there listening to her breathe, thinking about how much had changed since that day in Prescott when he'd loaded a dying stranger into his wagon. She wasn't a stranger anymore, and he couldn't imagine her gone. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the smell of more snow to come. But inside, the fire burned steady, and two people who'd faced death separately found themselves, against all odds and expectations, facing life together. The mountain had tested them, they'd answered, and winter, for all its fury, had only just begun. Winter settled in with the permanence of a guest who'd come to stay. Snow lay thick across the high country, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and merciless. The creek froze solid except where it ran fastest over rocks. Icicles hung from the mill roof like rows of teeth. Each morning brought frost thick enough to paint the inside of the windows with ferns and flowers that would never bloom. But inside the cabin, life had found a rhythm. Josephine's leg healed slowly but surely. Within 2 weeks she could walk without limping, though cold weather made it ache. The wound had scarred, a puckered line on her shin that would mark her forever, but infection had never set in. She considered that a minor miracle, though Samuel insisted it was simply proper care and clean bandages. Her lungs, surprisingly, seemed better. The coughing continued, but less violently. Some mornings she'd wake without that crushing weight on her chest, without the immediate need to sit up and fight for air. She didn't trust it. Consumption was a liar, she'd learned. It would retreat and let you hope, then come back twice as hard when you'd lowered your guard. Still, she felt stronger than she had in 2 years. Strong enough to work. Samuel had grain sacks that needed mending, shirts with buttons missing, a coat with a torn lining. Josephine took to these tasks with the focus of someone who understood the value of useful hands. She'd been a seamstress once before illness had made her fingers shake too much for fine work. But these rough repairs suited her current capabilities. Practical stitches meant to hold, not to impress. She worked by the window, where the light was best, her needle flashing silver as she pulled thread through canvas and wool. Samuel would watch sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. There was something mesmerizing about the steady rhythm of her hands, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the small sound of satisfaction she made when a particularly stubborn seam finally closed. "You're staring," she said one afternoon without looking up. Samuel, caught, cleared his throat. "Just wondering how you learned to sew like that. My mother taught me. Said a woman needed a trade that traveled with her, something that couldn't be taken away." She knotted off a thread and bit it clean. "Turns out she was right. Lost everything else, but I can still make a straight seam. Your mother sounds wise. She was, also stubborn as an ox, and twice as mean when crossed." Josephine smiled at the memory. "I get my contrary nature from her. My father used to say we'd argue with the devil himself if we thought he was wrong." "And would you argue with the devil?" She considered this seriously. "Depends on what he was wrong about." Samuel laughed, a sound that had become more frequent over the past weeks. Josephine had discovered she liked making him laugh. His whole face changed when he did, years falling away to reveal someone younger, less burdened. They'd fallen into an easy domestic partnership that surprised them both. Samuel handled the heavy work, hauling wood, maintaining the mill, tending the horses. Josephine managed the household, cooking, cleaning, mending, rationing their supplies to last through winter. Neither questioned the division. It simply made sense. But there were tasks they did together. One morning in mid-December, Samuel announced they needed to take inventory of the root cellar. The small dugout beneath the house held their winter stores: potatoes, carrots, onions, dried beans, salted meat. Knowing exactly what they had would determine how carefully they needed to ration until spring. They descended the ladder into the earth-smelling darkness, Samuel carrying a lantern. The cellar was small, barely 6 feet square, with shelves lining 3 walls. Josephine began counting while Samuel made notes on a scrap of paper. 42 pounds of potatoes, give or take, she said, hefting one of the sacks. "How many gone soft?" She checked. "Maybe a dozen. I'll sort them out. Use them first." They worked through the inventory methodically. Dried beans, 3 full sacks. Cornmeal, 1.5. Salted venison, enough for perhaps 20 meals if stretched. Onions, a good supply. Carrots, less than she'd hoped. Coffee, dangerously low. "We'll need to be careful with the coffee," Samuel said, frowning at his notes. "Or we could just quit drinking it," Josephine suggested. He looked at her as if she'd proposed they stop breathing. "That's not funny. Wasn't meant to be. I can manage without it." "Well, I can't. Coffee's about the only vice I've got left." She raised an eyebrow. "The only one? The only one I'm admitting to?" They climbed back up into the cabin, and Samuel spread his calculations on the table. If they were careful, very careful, they had enough food to last until April, maybe early May. That assumed no catastrophes, no spoilage, no unexpected emergencies. "It'll be tight," he said. "We'll manage." "You sound certain?" Josephine met his eyes. "We've managed everything else." Over the following weeks, they found other projects to occupy the long winter days. Samuel had been planning to build a proper chicken coop come spring. Fresh eggs would be a godsend after months of preserved food. But with time on his hands and lumber already cut, he decided to start the work indoors, assembling the frame by the fire where his hands wouldn't freeze. Josephine helped, holding boards steady while he hammered, passing him nails, offering opinions on the design. She knew nothing about carpentry, but she understood structure and balance from years of cutting cloth. When she suggested angling the roof steeper to shed snow better, Samuel paused, considered, then nodded. "That's smart. Would have regretted it come next winter." "Next winter," she repeated softly. The phrase hung in the air between them, an assumption of future, of her still being here when the snow came again. Samuel didn't acknowledge it directly, just returned to his hammering, but something in his shoulders relaxed, as if a question he'd been afraid to ask had been answered without words. The coop took shape over 2 weeks, a careful construction of pine boards and wire mesh. When it was finished, Samuel set it aside and moved to his next next project, a bookshelf. The single volume of Pilgrim's Progress had been joined by two others he'd acquired on his last trip to town, a farmer's almanac and a collection of Robert Burns' poetry that the general store owner had been trying to sell for years. "I didn't know you read poetry," Josephine said, watching him measure and cut. "I don't, usually, but winters are long. May I?" She reached for the Burns. "Help yourself." She opened it randomly and began reading aloud. "But pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever." Samuel stopped cutting. "What's that one called?" "Tam O'Shanter. It's about a man who stays too late at the tavern and sees things he shouldn't." Seems appropriate. We're both seeing things we shouldn't, you being alive, me being less of a hermit. Josephine laughed. "I think those are good things to see." "Maybe so." She continued reading, her voice filling the cabin with rhythms and rhymes from a country neither of them had seen. Samuel worked while she read, the saw and her voice creating a strange harmony. When she finished one poem, she'd start another. When she grew tired, he'd tell her about the trees, how to read their rings, which wood split easiest, the way certain pines wept sap like tears when cut. They were teaching each other without realizing it, her words for his wood knowledge, her refinement for his practical skills. Slowly they were building something beyond mere survival. One evening, Josephine set down the Burns and asked, "Why timber? Why this life?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He set aside the shelf board he'd been sanding and stared into the fire. "After the war, I couldn't stand being around people," he finally said. "Couldn't stand their questions, their expectations, the way they'd look at you if you'd survived when their sons or husbands hadn't. Trees don't ask questions, don't judge. You treat them right. They give you what you need. Is that enough? Just what you need?" It was, for a long time. He glanced at her. "Now I'm not sure what enough means anymore." Josephine understood. Her own definition of enough had changed too. Once it had been simply surviving each day, making it to nightfall, with breath still in her lungs. Now she found herself thinking about spring, about planting a real garden, about whether they could get chickens before summer. The future had expanded from hours to months. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "about the garden come spring. If we started seeds inside in March, we could transplant them in May when the ground thaws. Get a jump on the growing season." Samuel looked at her, really looked, and she saw the question in his eyes, the one he wouldn't ask. "Will you be here in March, in May?" "I'd like that," he said quietly. They fell silent then, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Outside, wind rattled the shutters and snow hissed against the walls. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamp burned steady. Samuel returned to his sanding. Josephine picked up his spare shirt that needed buttons replaced, but something had shifted between them. Some invisible line had been crossed. They weren't just surviving winter anymore. They were planning for spring. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Neither of them were particularly religious, though Josephine read the nativity story from Samuel's Bible on Christmas Eve, her voice soft in the lamplight. Samuel's gift to her was a pair of leather gloves he'd made from scraps, lined with rabbit fur for warmth. Hers to him was a new shirt, carefully sewn from fabric she'd salvaged from her own spare dress, letting out seams and restitching until she had enough material. "You didn't have to ruin your dress," Samuel said, holding the shirt. "I have two. You had one with more hole than fabric. Simple mathematics." He tried it on. It fit perfectly, and she felt a small surge of pride at getting the measurements right just from Observation. Thank you, he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. You're welcome. That night, after Josephine had gone to bed, Samuel sat by the fire wearing his new shirt and thinking about how much had changed. Last Christmas he'd been alone, had spent the day working the mill because there was nothing else to do and no one to do it with. This year there'd been gift-giving and Bible reading and a woman asleep in his bed who by all rights should have been dead. He should have been terrified by how much he'd come to depend on her presence, should have been building walls against the inevitable because consumption was still consumption and miracles didn't last forever. But he couldn't summon the fear. Every day she lived was a day he hadn't expected to have. He'd learned to stop counting them and just live them. January brought the coldest weather yet. Temperatures plunged so low that water left in a cup overnight froze solid. The horses huddled in the barn, their breath creating clouds of ice. Samuel had to break ice on the creek each morning just to water the animals. His hands, already damaged from the mill work, cracked and bled despite the gloves Josephine had made. She tended his hands the way he'd once tended her leg, with competent gentleness and no unnecessary sympathy. She'd make poultices from herbs she'd gathered the previous fall, wrap his fingers in soft cloth, insist he rest them while she handled tasks that didn't require heavy grip strength. You take care of me, I take care of you, she said when he protested. That's how this works. This? He asked. She gestured vaguely at the space between them. Whatever this is. Samuel didn't push for definition. He was content to let it remain unnamed. This thing they were building. Naming it might break it, might make it subject to rules and expectations neither of them could meet. But alone at night, lying on his pallet while Josephine slept, he knew what it was becoming, knew and couldn't stop it, didn't want to stop it, even though the risk of loss terrified him more than any storm or hardship. He was falling in love with a dying woman. The thought should have paralyzed him. Instead, it clarified everything. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures, and the first hints that winter might eventually end. The sun climbed higher each day. Icicles began to drip at noon. Samuel caught Josephine standing at the window one afternoon, her hand pressed against the glass, staring out at the snow-covered world with an expression of pure longing. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I want to see it green again. Want to see what this place looks like when it's alive. It's alive now, just sleeping. Then I want to see it wake up." She turned to him. "Do you think I will? See the spring?" It was the first time she'd asked directly. Samuel crossed to stand beside her, looking out at the same view. "Yes," he said, "I think you will. You can't know that." "No, but I believe it anyway." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the first time she'd deliberately touched him beyond necessity. He felt the weight of her, slight but real, and carefully put his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the winter light fade to blue dusk. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Outside, a raven called from the top of a pine. Inside, two people who'd been strangers 4 months ago stood together and chose, against all logic and medical certainty, to believe in tomorrow. Spring was coming, and they would see it together. March came in like a promise half-kept. The snow began to recede, not in a dramatic thaw, but in slow increments. An inch here, a patch of bare ground there. Water ran everywhere, dripping from roofs, trickling down hillsides, swelling the creek until it roared like something alive and angry. The air smelled different, carrying hints of wet earth, and dormant things stirring beneath the surface. Samuel made his first trip to town since before Christmas. The trail was navigable again, though muddy enough to mire a wagon to the axles if a man wasn't careful. He took the horses, planning to pack supplies rather than haul them, and left at dawn. Josephine stood in the doorway watching him go, wrapped in her shawl against the morning chill. Something twisted in Samuel's chest as he looked back and saw her there. This woman who'd become the center of his world without either of them quite acknowledging it. He raised a hand, she raised hers in return. Then he turned his horse and rode down the mountain. Prescott had changed in the months he'd been away, or perhaps Samuel had changed and saw it differently now. The town seemed louder, more chaotic. People moved with purposes that seemed trivial compared to the simple survival he and Josephine had been practicing. He found himself irritated by idle chatter, impatient with the formalities of commerce. Morrison at the general store greeted him with poorly concealed curiosity. Samuel Brennan thought maybe you'd frozen up there, still breathing. And the woman, the sick one? Samuel loaded his arms with flour, coffee, sugar, also breathing. Morrison's eyebrows climbed. Doc said she wouldn't make it to New Year's. Doc was wrong. Well, I'll be damned. She must be tougher than she looks. Samuel paid for his supplies and left before the questions could continue. But word had already spread. He couldn't walk 10 feet without someone stopping him, asking about the consumptive woman, offering unsolicited medical advice, or worse, sharing stories of their own relatives who'd died from lung disease. Doc Hartley cornered him outside the feed store. I hear she's still with us, the doctor said without preamble. She is. I'd like to examine her, verify what I'm hearing. Samuel felt a protective instinct rise sharp in his throat. She doesn't need examining. She's managing fine. Samuel, the woman had advanced consumption. If she's truly improved, that's medically significant. I should document. She's not a curiosity for you to document. She's a person living her life. Doc Hartley's expression softened. I'm not trying to make her a spectacle. I'm trying to understand. Consumption doesn't just get better. If she's found some way to arrest the disease, even temporarily, other sufferers deserve to know. Samuel considered this. It was reasonable, even compassionate, but the thought of Josephine being poked and prodded, treated like a medical puzzle rather than a woman, made his jaw clench. I'll ask her, he said finally. But it's her choice. Fair enough. Samuel finished his errands and was loading the last of his supplies when he heard a familiar voice. Samuel Brennan, didn't expect to see you above ground. He turned to find Pete Garrison, who ran the livery stable, leaning against a post with a knowing grin. Pete was one of the few people in Prescott Samuel could tolerate, a straight talker who'd survived his own share of hardship and didn't waste time on nonsense. Pete, heard you've got yourself a woman up there? Heard that, did you? Whole town's heard. Some say she's your housekeeper. Others say she's your patient. Widow Harper thinks you've taken in a fallen woman and are living in sin. Pete's grin widened. Me, I think you finally got tired of your own cooking. Despite himself, Samuel smiled. All of those might be true. So, which is she? Housekeeper? Patient? Something else? Samuel looked at his friend, at the genuine curiosity without judgment, and found himself answering honestly. I don't know. She came here dying, hasn't died. We've been living together, working together, surviving winter together. What that makes us, I couldn't say. Pete nodded slowly. You planning to marry her? The question landed like a physical blow. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it, found he had no ready answer. Thought about it? Pete pressed. I don't think about much else lately, Samuel admitted. But she's still sick, Pete. Still coughs blood some mornings, still gets fevers. What kind of man asks a dying woman to marry him? The kind who loves her enough not to let propriety stand in the way of honesty. Pete pushed off the post. Look, I'm not one for romance or sentiment, but I've seen enough death to know this. If you've got something real with someone, doesn't matter how long it lasts. Could be 50 years, could be 50 days. What matters is you claim it while you can. Samuel stood there in the muddy street, holding his horse's reins, feeling something shift inside him. Pete was right. He'd been so focused on Josephine's illness, on the impossibility of her survival, that he'd failed to see what was actually happening. They were building a life together, not waiting for one to start, not preparing for one to end, but living one right now. I need to get back, Samuel said abruptly. Pete grinned. Yeah, you do. The ride home seemed longer than the ride down. Samuel pushed harder than he should have, arriving at the cabin as the sun was setting. Josephine was outside, tending the small fire pit they used for washing, and looked up in surprise when she heard the horses. "You're back early. Thought you'd stay till morning." Samuel dismounted, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the ride. "Had everything I needed." She studied his face. "What happened?" "Need to talk to you after we unload." They worked together in the fading light, carrying supplies inside, putting things away in their established order. Samuel kept catching himself watching her, the way she moved, the small sounds she made when lifting something heavy, the unconscious grace in her simplest gestures. How had he ever thought he could keep her at arm's length? When everything was stored, Josephine made coffee and they sat at the table. The lamp cast warm light across her face, picking out threads of silver in her dark hair. She waited, patient as always, for him to find his words. "Doc Hartley wants to examine you," Samuel started. "Says your recovery is medically significant. I told him it was your choice." "All right, you don't have to. You're not obligated to be anyone's medical curiosity." "I know, but if it helps someone else, why not?" She sipped her coffee. "That's not what's bothering you, though?" He'd never been able to hide anything from her. "No. So what is?" Samuel took a breath. This was harder than facing any storm, more terrifying than any threat to his physical safety. "People in town are talking about us, about what it means. You're living here. I imagine they are. Does it bother you?" "What do they say?" Josephine set down her cup carefully. "Samuel, I'm a woman with consumption living alone with an unmarried man in the mountains. I stopped caring what people said about me the day I accepted I was dying. Their opinions can't hurt me worse than this disease already has. What if we gave them a different story to tell?" She went very still. "What do you mean?" He'd planned to work up to this, to make a logical argument, to approach it the way he'd approach any business arrangement. But looking at her across the table, lit by lamplight, very much alive, despite every prediction to the contrary, logic failed him. "Marry me," he said. The silence that followed felt like falling. Josephine stared at him, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Why? Why? Yes, why? Is it because of what people are saying? Because you feel responsible for me? Because I love you?" The words came out rougher than he'd intended, pulled from some deep place he'd kept locked for years. Josephine's eyes went wide. "You love me," she repeated, as if testing the words for truth. "Yes, Samuel, I'm dying. You've been dying for 6 months. Doesn't seem to be taking." "That's not funny. Wasn't meant to be." He leaned forward. "Josephine, I know you're sick. I know you might get worse. I know there are no guarantees. But here's what I also know. I wake up every morning grateful you're still here. I go to sleep every night afraid you won't be there come dawn. You've become the center of everything, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Tears welled in her eyes. "You deserve better than a wife who might not see next winter. I deserve to make my own choices about what I want, and I want you for however long we get." He reached across the table, took her hand. "Pete Garrison asked me today what you were to me. I couldn't answer him because we've never named it, but I'm naming it now. You're the woman I love, the woman I want to build a life with, the woman I want to marry. Even knowing, especially knowing, I'm not asking you to promise me 50 years. I'm asking you to promise me tomorrow, and the day after, and every day we get until we don't get any more. Josephine pulled her hand back, stood abruptly, walked to the window. Samuel's heart sank. He'd miscalculated, pushed too hard, ruined what they had by asking for more. Then she spoke, her back still to him. When I got on that stage in Ohio, I had $6 and a death sentence. I came west to die in sunshine instead of snow. That's all I expected. A warm place to stop breathing. She turned to face him. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but she was smiling. You gave me winter instead. Gave me cold and work and reason to fight. Gave me tomorrow when I'd given up on today. She crossed back to him. So yes, Samuel Brennan, I'll marry you for tomorrow and every day after, for as long as those days last. Samuel stood so fast, the chair tipped over. He caught her in his arms, and she came to him without hesitation. They held each other in the lamplight, two people who'd found each other at the end of everything and chosen to begin. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and neither cared. We should do it soon, Josephine said, wiping her eyes, before I lose my nerve or you come to your senses. Tomorrow too soon? She laughed, the sound bright with joy and disbelief. Tomorrow's perfect. They sat up late that night making plans. There would be no fancy ceremony, no church wedding, no gathered crowd, just them and whoever they could find to make it legal. They'd ride down to Prescott at first light, find someone qualified to perform a marriage, and do it before anyone could talk them out of it. Should I wear my good dress? Josephine asked. Do you have a good dress? I have one that's less patched than the other. Then wear that. I'll wear my new shirt. The one I made from my old dress? Seems fitting. Something old, something new. She smiled at him across the table, and Samuel felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. This woman, this impossible, stubborn, half-dead woman who'd refused to die on schedule. How had he ever imagined life without her? That night, Samuel gave Josephine the bed as always. But before he settled on his pallet, she called out to him, Samuel? Yeah? I'm scared. He crossed to sit on the edge of the bed. Of what? Of being happy. Every time I've let myself hope for something, it's been taken away. My daughter, my health, everything. She looked up at him, vulnerable, in a way he'd never seen her. What if I let myself be happy with you and then we'll have been happy for however long we got? That's more than most people ever have. She took his hand, held it against her cheek. You really believe that? I do. Then I'll try to believe it too. He kissed her forehead, gentle as prayer, then returned to his pallet. But he lay awake long into the night, listening to her breathe, already mourning and celebrating simultaneously. Tomorrow he'd marry her. Tomorrow they'd bind their lives together. Sickness and health, whatever time remained. It was the worst decision he'd ever make. Dawn came cold and clear. They dressed in their best clothes, Josephine in her less patched blue dress, Samuel in the shirt she'd sewn for him. Neither ate much breakfast. The horses were saddled and ready by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The ride down to Prescott passed in comfortable silence. Josephine sat her horse well despite months of illness, back straight, face turned toward the warming sun. Samuel watched her from the corner of his eye and thought about how she'd looked that first day in town, pale and defeated, already half ghost. The woman riding beside him now was still thin, still marked by disease, but there was life in her that hadn't been there before. Fight, hope, love. They reached town mid-morning. Samuel led them directly to the territorial courthouse, a granite building that housed the justice of the peace. Inside, they found Judge Morrison, no relation to the general store Morrison, a gruff man in his 70s who'd been marrying and divorcing the citizens of Prescott for 20 years. Samuel Brennan, the judge said, looking up from his paperwork, what brings you down from your mountain? Come to get married? The judge's eyebrows climbed. That's so? And who's the unfortunate woman? I am, Josephine said, stepping forward. Josephine Caldwell, though I assure you I consider myself quite fortunate. Judge Morrison studied her, recognition dawning. You're the consumptive woman, the one everyone said wouldn't last the winter. The same. Well, he sat back in his chair. I'll be damned. You look considerably more alive than I was led to believe. I've been told I'm contrary by nature. The judge barked a laugh. Samuel, I think you might have met your match. He pulled out a ledger. You got witnesses? No, sir. Need two. Legal requirement. He called out toward the back office. Martha, need you and Bill out here. Two clerks emerged. A middle-aged woman and a young man barely out of his teens. They stood as witnesses while the judge ran through the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man reading a grocery list. The words were simple, perfunctory, legal rather than romantic. But when Samuel said, I do, his voice was steady and sure. And when Josephine said, I do, her eyes were bright with tears and she refused to let fall. Judge Morrison pronounced them married, had them sign the register, and collected his $2 fee. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Samuel had seen livestock transactions that involved more ceremony. Congratulations, the judge said, handing Samuel the marriage certificate. May you have many years together. Thank you, Samuel said, though he and Josephine both knew many years was unlikely. They stepped out of the courthouse into brilliant sunshine, married, legal, bound together by law and choice and something deeper than either. Well, Mrs. Brennan, Samuel said, that's done. Josephine looked at the marriage certificate in his hands, then up at him. Mrs. Brennan, I haven't been anyone's missus in a long time. You are now. She reached for his hand. He took hers, and there, on the courthouse steps in front of God and Prescott and anyone who cared to watch, Samuel Brennan kissed his wife for the first time. It was nothing like the kisses in books or stories. No swooning, no passion that swept them away. Just a gentle press of lips, warm and alive, real as the mountain air. When they pulled apart, Josephine was crying. Happy tears, she assured him. I'd forgotten what those felt like. They rode back to the mill in the afternoon light, taking their time, stretching out the day. When they finally arrived home, and it was home now truly for both of them, Samuel helped Josephine down from her horse and carried her over the threshold. We're already inside, she protested, laughing. Humor me, it's tradition. He set her down gently in the middle of the cabin they'd shared for months. But it was different now. Not just a place they both lived, but their place, their home, their beginning. That night they lay together in the bed for the first time, Josephine in Samuel's arms, both fully clothed, neither sleeping, just holding each other and listening to the world outside. Wind in the pines, creek running full with snowmelt, night birds calling. Samuel? Josephine whispered. Thank you. For what? For believing I'd live long enough to marry you? He tightened his arms around her. Thank you for proving me right. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Inside, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds lay together and chose to believe in impossible things. Tomorrow, spring, years, together. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the high country into something wild and hopeful. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving behind meadows carpeted with wildflowers, lupine and paintbrush, columbine and golden banner. The aspens leafed out in brilliant green. Bears emerged from their dens, thin and irritable. Deer moved through the timber with their newborn fawns. The creek ran so high and fast it drowned out the sound of the saw blade. Samuel and Josephine settled into married life with the ease of people who'd already been living as partners. The only real change was the bed. They shared it now. Though their intimacy remained chaste, Josephine's health was still fragile, her body still marked by disease. Some nights she'd wake gasping, coughing so hard Samuel had to hold her upright until the spell passed. But more often now, She'd sleep peacefully, curled against his side, her breathing steady and even. They planted the garden in late April, working side by side to turn the earth and sow seeds. Josephine had kept back seeds from their winter vegetables: potato eyes, onion sets, dried beans. Samuel bought more in town: corn, squash, carrots, lettuce. They worked the soil until it was soft and rich, then planted in careful rows. "It might not take," Josephine said, standing back to survey their work. "Too high, too cold, short growing season." "Might not," Samuel agreed, "but we'll try anyway." She smiled at him, understanding the deeper meaning. They were always trying anyway, against odds and common sense and medical certainty. The chickens arrived in May, 6 hens and a rooster, purchased from a farmer outside Prescott and transported in a crate on Samuel's wagon. They settled into the coop he'd built over winter, clucking and fussing and laying eggs with gratifying regularity. Josephine named them all, despite Samuel's protests that naming livestock was asking for heartache. "That's Prudence," she said, pointing to the largest hen, "and that's Constance and Mercy, and you're going to cry when a fox gets one. Then I'll cry, but at least I'll know who I'm mourning." Summer brought heat that felt like blessing after the brutal winter. Samuel worked the mill from dawn to mid-afternoon, then spent the cooler evening hours with Josephine in the garden, weeding and watering and watching things grow. They'd achieved a kind of rhythm, a balance of work and rest, solitude and companionship. Doc Hartley came to visit in June, riding up the trail on a hot Tuesday morning. Josephine agreed to the examination, and the doctor spent an hour listening to her lungs, checking her vitals, asking detailed questions about her symptoms. Afterwards, sitting at their table with coffee Samuel had brewed too strong, the doctor shook his head in bewilderment. "I don't understand it," he said. "Your lungs still show signs of disease. Scarring, reduced capacity, but the active infection seems to have arrested, not cured, but halted. I've never seen anything like it." "What does that mean?" Samuel asked. "It means she's not cured. The consumption is still there, dormant. It could flare up again at any time. Stress, another illness, even just bad luck. But for now, somehow she's holding it at bay." "How long?" Josephine asked quietly. Doc Hartley met her eyes. "I don't know. Could be months, could be years. The human body is more mysterious than any of us like to admit." After the doctor left, Samuel and Josephine sat in silence. The news was good, better than they'd dared hope. But it came with the weight of uncertainty, the knowledge that this reprieve might end at any moment. "We keep going," Samuel said finally. "Same as always, same as always," Josephine agreed. But 3 weeks later, everything changed. It started with a headache. Josephine woke one morning pressing her fingers to her temples, her face tight with pain. Samuel made her willow bark tea, insisted she rest. By afternoon, the headache had worsened. By evening, she was vomiting. "Just something I ate," she insisted between retching. "I'll be fine by morning." She wasn't. The fever came on fast and brutal. By the second day, Josephine was delirious, thrashing in the bed and calling out for people who weren't there. Her dead daughter, her vanished husband, her mother who'd been gone 20 years. Samuel tried everything he knew: cool cloths, fever tea, keeping her hydrated. Nothing worked. The consumption hadn't returned. This was something else, something new. On the third day, Samuel rode for Doc Hartley. The trail had never seemed longer, the horse never slower. He found the doctor at the courthouse, interrupted his meeting with the territorial governor, and demanded he come immediately. "Samuel, I have patients in town. My wife is dying right now. You're coming. Something in Samuel's face must have convinced him. Doc Hartley gathered his bag and followed. They rode back to the mill at a punishing pace. Samuel's horse was lathered and trembling by the time they arrived. Inside, Josephine lay motionless on the bed, her skin gray, her breathing shallow and irregular. The doctor examined her quickly, his expression growing grimmer by the moment. He checked her pulse, listened to her heart, looked at her eyes and throat. Finally, he sat back. "It's brain fever," he said, "probably from an infected tooth or sinus. It's spreading. Can you stop it?" "I can try, but Samuel—" Doc Hartley's voice was gentle. "You need to prepare yourself. Most people don't survive this. And in her weakened state, with the consumption still lurking, just do what you can." The doctor did. He lanced an abscess in Josephine's gums that Samuel hadn't even known was there, releasing a flood of pus and blood. He administered laudanum for the pain, quinine for the fever. He showed Samuel how to get water down her throat even when she was unconscious, how to watch for signs of seizures or stroke. Then he left, promising to return in 2 days if the trail stayed clear. Samuel sat beside the bed and began his vigil. The hours blurred together. Day became night, became day again. Samuel forced water between Josephine's lips, drop by drop. He changed the cloths on her forehead every time they grew warm. He held her down when the fever dreams made her violent, whispered to her when they made her weep. She didn't know him. 3 days married, 6 months living together, and she stared at him with eyes that held no recognition. Once she called him father. Once she screamed at him to get away, said he was a demon sent to claim her soul. Samuel endured it all. On the 4th night, her fever spiked higher. Samuel stripped the blankets and the clothes from her, sponged her entire body with cool water, desperate to bring down the heat that was cooking her from the inside. Her skin was so hot it nearly burned his hands. "Don't leave me," he said, knowing she couldn't hear. "We just started. We've got years planned, gardens to grow, chickens to raise, winters to survive. You don't get to leave now." No response, just her ragged breathing, the slight rise and fall of her chest. Samuel found himself praying, something he hadn't done since the war. Not eloquent prayers, just raw pleading. "Let her live. Let her stay. Take me instead if someone has to go. Just let her live." Dawn came gray and cold. The fever hadn't broken. Samuel sat slumped in the chair, exhausted beyond measure, watching his wife die by inches. Then, just as the sun cleared the ridge, Josephine opened her eyes. "Samuel?" His head snapped up. "I'm here. Water!" He nearly sobbed with relief. She knew him. She was coherent. He held a cup to her lips and she drank. Not much, but enough. "How long?" she whispered. 4 days. "Feels longer." Her eyes closed again. "Tired?" "Then sleep. I'm right here." She slept. And this time it was real sleep, not the unconscious drift of fever. Her temperature was down, her breathing was easier. When Samuel placed his hand on her forehead, it was merely warm, not burning. She was going to live. Doc Hartley confirmed it when he returned the next day. The infection was receding. The fever had broken. Barring complications, she'd recover. "Though it'll take time," he warned. "Brain fever takes a toll. She'll be weak for weeks, maybe months. And the risk to her lungs, any secondary infection could reactivate the consumption. I'll take care of her." "I know you will." Doc Hartley packed his bag. "Samuel, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years. I've seen people survive impossible things and die from trivial ones. Your wife has now beaten consumption and brain fever. I don't know if she's the luckiest woman in Arizona or the most stubborn, but either way, she's got something keeping her alive." After the doctor left, Samuel sat on the edge of the bed and took Josephine's hand. "You scared me," he said quietly. "I scared myself." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I thought I thought I was finally dying. After all these months fighting, I thought this was it. But it wasn't. No. She squeezed his hand weakly. I'm still here, still stubborn. Thank God for that. Recovery was slow. For 2 weeks, Josephine could barely stand without help. Samuel had to carry her outside when she needed air, support her while she ate, help her with every basic task. She hated the dependence, the weakness. Once she cried from sheer frustration at not being able to walk across the room without collapsing. Samuel held her and said, "You carried me through winter with your cooking and mending. I'll carry you now. Fair trade. It's not the same. It's exactly the same." Gradually, strength returned. First, she could sit up unaided, then stand, then walk short distances. By the end of June, she was moving around the cabin freely, though still too weak for heavy work. The garden had suffered during her illness. Weeds had taken over, and some plants had died from lack of water, but others had survived, and Josephine tended them with the fierce attention of someone who understood that growth and survival were never guaranteed. One evening in early July, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the peaks orange and gold. Josephine leaned against Samuel's shoulder, comfortable in a way she'd once thought impossible. 2 close calls in 6 months, she said. First, the consumption that should have killed me. Now I have brain fever. You're not easy to kill. Apparently not. She was quiet for a moment. Samuel, what if next time? There might not be a next time. But if there is, if the consumption comes back or something else happens, then we'll fight it, same as we fought everything else. She pulled back to look at him. You can't save me from everything. Sometimes people just die, despite everyone's best efforts. I know that. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. Her eyes were serious. I need you to understand something. I'm grateful for every day I get, but I won't live forever. Nobody does. And when my time comes, whenever that is, I need to know you'll be all right. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. How can you ask me to think about that? Because someone has to. Because I love you too much to leave you unprepared. I'm not having this conversation. We need to. No, he stood abruptly. You're not dying today or tomorrow or any time soon if I have anything to say about it. So we're not planning your funeral. We're planning next year's garden, and how many chickens we can support, and whether we should expand the house before next winter. That's what we're planning. Josephine stood too, slower but steady. She crossed to him and took his face in her hands. All right, she said gently. We'll plan for living, but Samuel, when the time comes, you have to let me go. I can't. You can. You will, because you're strong enough. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She was right, he knew. Death came for everyone eventually, but not today. Not while he had the breath to fight and will to resist. Not yet, he said against her hair. Please, not yet. Not yet, she agreed, but someday. They stood together as the light faded. 2 people who'd faced death separately and together, who'd learned that survival was equal parts luck and stubbornness and love. The mountain darkened around them. Stars began to appear overhead, cold and distant and eternal. Inside the cabin, the lamp was lit. The chickens had settled in their coop. The garden grew quietly in the dark. Everything they'd built together remained solid and real. Josephine had survived again, but both of them knew the truth now, carried it like a stone in their pockets. Eventually, one of them would lose this fight. The only question was when. For now they had tonight, tomorrow, next week. For now they had each other. It would have to be enough. The years passed in the way years do when you stop counting them and start living them. 1874 became 75, then 80, then 90. The high country witnessed seasons turn in their ancient rhythm. Snow and thaw, bloom and harvest, frost and dormancy. The mill operated steadily, providing timber for the growing towns below. The cabin expanded, room by room, as Samuel and Josephine's life together required more space for the things they accumulated. Books, tools, memories. Josephine never fully recovered from the consumption. It remained in her lungs like an uninvited guest who'd learned to be quiet but wouldn't leave. Some mornings she'd wake coughing blood. Some winters she'd spend weeks too weak to leave the house. But she didn't die. Month after month, year after year, she simply continued. Doc Hartley stopped making predictions. He'd examine her annually and shake his head in professional bewilderment. "You should be dead," he'd say matter-of-factly. "Medically speaking, you have no business still breathing." "Good thing I never cared much for medical opinions," Josephine would reply. The garden flourished. What had started as a survival measure became Josephine's domain, expanding each year until they had more vegetables than two people could eat. She began preserving the surplus, canning tomatoes, pickling cucumbers, drying beans and herbs. The root cellar filled with jars that glowed like jewels in the lamplight. The chickens multiplied. What began as 6 hens became a flock of 20, providing eggs not just for their table but for trade in town. Josephine still named every bird, still mourned when predators or age claimed them. Samuel stopped teasing her about it after the 3rd year. In 1878, they acquired a milk cow. In 81, a pair of goats. The homestead grew from a bachelor's sparse efficiency into something resembling a real farm. Samuel built a proper barn, expanded the fencing, dug a second well. The work never ended, but neither did they. People in Prescott forgot that Josephine was supposed to be dead. She became simply Samuel's wife, the quiet woman who came to town once a month, who traded eggs and vegetables, who attended church on Easter and Christmas. Some remembered she'd been sick once, but the details faded. She was just another pioneer woman making a life in hard country, but they hadn't forgotten each other's stories. On their 10th anniversary, Samuel took Josephine to the place where he'd first thought about marrying her, the bluff overlooking the valley. They sat on the same flat rock where they'd stood a decade before, older now, marked by weather and work and time. 10 years, Josephine said, staring out at the view. The doctor gave me a month. You always were contrary, she smiled. Remember when you proposed? You said you weren't asking for 50 years, just tomorrow and the day after. I remember. We've had 3,650 tomorrows now, give or take. Samuel took her hand. It was rougher than it had been, scarred from garden work and kitchen accidents and the general wear of living. But it fit in his the same as always. Think we'll get 3,000 more? She asked. I've learned not to make predictions where you're concerned. They sat in comfortable silence, watching an eagle circle overhead. 10 years had taught them that silence could be as meaningful as words, that presence mattered more than promises. In 1885, Samuel turned 44 and Josephine 62. The age gap that had never mattered between them became more visible. Samuel's hair was still mostly dark, his movements still strong. Josephine had gone completely silver, her face deeply lined, her body increasingly frail. People sometimes mistook her for his mother, which amused them both. Should bother me more, Josephine said one evening after a stranger in town had made the assumption. Does it bother you at all? Not really. I'm alive to be mistaken for someone I'm not. That's victory enough. But that winter brought a new challenge. Not illness this time, but simple aging. Josephine's joints stiffened with arthritis. Her vision dimmed. The climb from the cabin to the mill, which she'd made thousands of times, became increasingly difficult. She fought it with her characteristic stubbornness, refusing to accept limitations until her body forced them upon her. Samuel adapted without comment. He moved her sewing chair closer to the window for better light. He built a railing on the porch steps. He took over tasks that required strength or clear sight, while she focused on work that suited her capabilities. They never discussed it, never acknowledged the slow retreat. They simply adjusted. In 1888, Doc Hartley died. His replacement, a young physician from Philadelphia named Dr. Warren, heard about Josephine and requested to examine her as a medical curiosity. She refused. "I'm not a curiosity," she told Samuel. "I'm just a woman who hasn't died yet." "He means well, wants to learn. Then he can learn from someone else. I'm tired of being poked and studied like a specimen in a jar." Samuel didn't push. 15 years had taught him which battles to fight. The new century arrived with little fanfare. Josephine was 69, Samuel 53. The mill still operated, though Samuel had hired help now, a young man named Tom who did the heavy work while Samuel managed the business. The homestead had become something of a landmark, the old couple who'd built it local legends in their own small way. One spring morning in 1902, Josephine was working in the garden when a pain seized her chest. She dropped the hoe and stood very still, waiting for it to pass. It didn't. Samuel found her there 10 minutes later, sitting on the ground, face gray, breathing shallow. "Heart," she said simply. He carried her inside and sent Tom for the doctor. Dr. Warren arrived by evening, examined her, and delivered his verdict with the careful professionalism of youth. "Her heart is failing. At her age, with her history of illness, there's nothing to be done. Keep her comfortable. It could be days or weeks." Samuel sat beside the bed after the doctor left. Josephine was awake, calm, her hand in his. "Remember when I asked you to let me go when the time came?" she said. "I remember. I think the time's coming." Something broke inside Samuel, something he'd kept carefully sealed for 29 years. "Not yet. Samuel, not yet. You've beaten everything else. You'll beat this too." She smiled sadly. "Some things can't be beaten, just endured until they're done with you." But she didn't die that week or the next. The heart episode passed, leaving her weaker but alive. Summer came, and with it enough strength to sit outside in the sun. Autumn arrived with its blaze of color. Winter settled in gentle that year, as if the mountain itself was being kind. By spring of 1903, Josephine was moving around again, slower but steady. Dr. Warren examined her and added another note to her increasingly thick medical file. "Patient continues to defy all expectations." "How do you do it?" the young doctor asked her directly. "What keeps you alive when by all rights you should have died 30 years ago?" Josephine considered the question seriously. "Spite, mostly, and good coffee, and a husband too stubborn to let me quit." Samuel, standing nearby, said nothing, but his hand found hers. The years continued their march. 1905, 1910, 1915. The world changed around them. Automobiles appeared in Prescott. Electricity reached some of the larger buildings. Airplanes flew overhead, but the high country remained largely untouched, and Samuel and Josephine's life maintained its quiet rhythm. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1913. Josephine was 82, still coughing blood on bad mornings, still fighting the consumption that had become her lifelong companion. Samuel was 66, his beard gone white, his hands gnarled from decades of mill work. Tom, who'd been with them 15 years now, organized a small gathering. A few neighbors, some folks from town, the current doctor. Dr. Warren, now middle-aged himself and still fascinated by his impossible patient. They ate cake and shared stories, and someone asked the inevitable question. What's the secret? 40 years when she was supposed to last a month? Samuel and Josephine looked at each other. In that glance was everything. Every fight, every surrender, every morning they'd woken grateful for one more day. No secret, Josephine said. Just decided dying was too much of a bother. People laughed, thinking it was a joke. Only Samuel knew it was the absolute truth. In 1920, Samuel fell from the mill roof while making repairs. He broke his hip and 3 ribs, and at 73, such injuries didn't heal easily. For the first time in their marriage, he was the one bedridden, the one needing constant care. Josephine, now 89 and supposedly dying for 47 years, became his nurse. She moved with the careful slowness of great age, but she moved. She brought him water, changed his bandages, read to him from the books they'd accumulated over decades. Tom handled the mill work. Josephine handled Samuel. Role reversal, Samuel said one afternoon, watching her navigate the room with her cane. We've reversed roles before. This is just another turn. I'm supposed to take care of you? And you have for 47 years. My turn now. He recovered, though he never moved quite the same afterward. The fall had taken something from him. Not life, exactly, but the certainty of strength. He walked with a limp. He got tired easily. At 74, he finally looked his age. That winter they sat by the fire more than they worked. Tom ran the mill almost entirely now. The garden had shrunk to what Josephine could manage from a chair. The chickens were down to 6, the original number, though none of the original birds. They'd come full circle in so many ways. Do you have regrets? Josephine asked one evening. Samuel thought about it. Just one. What's that? That I didn't marry you sooner. Should have done it that first week. She laughed, the sound raspy but genuine. I was unconscious most of that first week. Should have done it anyway. That would have been improper. When have we ever cared about proper? She reached for his hand. Even that simple gesture took effort now. Her fingers stiff and trembling, but she managed it, and he held on. No regrets, she said. Not one. Josephine Caldwell Brennan died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1923. She was 92 years old. She'd survived consumption for 50 years and marriage for 49. She died in the bed she'd shared with Samuel, in the house they'd built together, surrounded by the life they'd created from nothing but stubbornness and love. Samuel was with her at the end. She woke before dawn, looked at him with clear eyes and said simply, "It's time, I know. Don't be sad. I'll try." "Liar," she smiled. "Be sad, but not forever. Promise me." "I promise." She closed her eyes then, her breathing slowing, becoming quiet. Samuel held her hand and watched the woman who'd been supposed to die in 1873 finally let go. She took her last breath as the sun cleared the ridge, light spilling golden across the room. Samuel sat with her for a long time after, memorizing her face one final time. The silver hair, the lines carved by decades of smiling and working and fighting, the hands that had planted 1,000 seeds and mended 1,000 tears and held his through every storm. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying, for every stubborn day." He buried her on the bluff overlooking the valley where they'd stood on their wedding day and their 10th anniversary and countless other moments stolen from work. Tom helped dig the grave. Dr. Warren came and said words about medical miracles and the resilience of the human spirit. A few neighbors attended, paying respects to the woman who'd outlived everyone's expectations. Samuel carved her headstone himself from pine, the wood he'd worked with for 54 years. Josephine Caldwell Brennan, 1831–1923. She stayed. People asked him afterwards what he'd do now. Would he close the mill? Move to town? Live with family? "I'll stay," he said simply, and he did. Samuel Brennan lived another 7 years, working the mill when he could, tending the garden Josephine had planted, caring for chickens whose names he'd finally learned. He never remarried, never left the mountain. Every evening he'd walk to the bluff and sit by her grave, telling her about his day, asking her opinion on decisions he still had to make. He died in his sleep in 1930, at the age of 83. Tom found him in the morning, peaceful in the bed he'd shared with Josephine for 49 years. They buried Samuel beside his wife, his headstone, carved by Tom in imitation of the one Samuel had made, read simply, Samuel Brennan, 1847-1930. He waited. The mill eventually closed. The cabin stood empty for years, then decades, slowly reclaimed by the forest. The garden went to seed. The chickens scattered. Time did what time always does. It moved forward, indifferent to the stories left behind. But in Prescott, and in the high country around it, people still told the story. Not as it actually happened. Memory simplified things, romanticized them, turned messy reality into clean narrative. But the core remained true. A man brought home a dying woman. She didn't die. They married. They lived longer than anyone expected, against every medical prediction, through consumption and brain fever and simple aging. 50 years when she'd been given a month. The details changed with each telling. Some said it was love that cured her. Others said it was the mountain air. A few claimed she'd never really been that sick, that the whole thing was exaggerated. But those who knew them, who'd seen Josephine coughing blood into a handkerchief, who'd watched Samuel carry her when she couldn't walk, who'd witnessed the quiet daily miracle of their survival. They knew the truth. It wasn't love that saved her. It wasn't the air. It wasn't medicine or prayer or anything you could name and bottle. It was a choice. Every morning, Josephine chose to live another day. Every morning, Samuel chose to fight for her. Together, they chose each other over and over, year after year, until choice became habit and habit became life. They'd been warned it was impossible. They'd done it anyway, and somewhere in the high pines of Arizona, where the creek still runs and the wind still whispers through branches, their story remains, not in words or monuments, but in the simpler truth of two graves side by side, facing the valley they'd loved and the life they'd built together. She stayed, he waited, they endured. That was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.